let's take a look at a quick example of how we can apply the first derivative and find out some really important information about this polynomial. So we're going to do three things in this video. First, we're going to figure out where the function is increasing and decreasing. Second, we're going to look at all of the relative extrema using the first derivative test. And then third, we're going to identify the absolute maximum and minimum values on the closed interval 0 to 4. Okay, so let's start off by figuring out where the function is increasing and decreasing. So the steps to do that, step number one is just to take the first derivative, which I've done here just using the power rule. Second step, we're going to find the critical points by taking our derivative and setting it equal to 0. This is basically just has to do with factoring. I actually dropped my 3 there, but there is a GCF of 3 that I pulled out. And then I went ahead and factored it here. I set each one of these equal to 0, and I got my critical points of x equals 1 and x equals 3. In case I'm going too quickly through these algebraic steps, please feel free to pause the video. I just want to focus on the high-level calculus part of this. So next, step 3, we're going to create a sign chart. So let me do my best to kind of set this up. So basically how sign charts work. First, let me just write out my critical points. Okay, so basically for every critical point that I have, I want to pick a value both to the left and right of it, and I want to look at what the derivative is doing basically around these critical points. So I'm just going to pick x equals 0 for my point to the left of 1, because that's usually an easy number to plug in. I'm going to pick x equals 2 for my point between 1 and 3, and then I'm going to pick x equals 4 for my point to the right of 3. And so now let me just rewrite my derivative formula. It was x squared minus 4x plus 3. And then I'm going to go ahead and plug in these values, and I'm just going to have to say whether it's positive or negative when I plug it in. So when I plug in 0, I get 3, which is a positive value. When I plug in my critical point, we already know it's going to be 0, so I can just automatically fill those in. When I plug in 2 here, I end up getting 4 minus 8 plus 3, so that's a negative value. And then when x equals 4, when I plug that in, I get 3, which is a positive value. So what does that tell me? So basically, I know that from negative infinity to 1, which is over here, it's going to be increasing. I also know that over here, from 3 to infinity, it's going to be increasing as well. And then in the middle of those, between 1 and 3, which is right here, I know that it's going to be decreasing. So this is how you can use a sign chart to identify the intervals where it's increasing and decreasing. Okay, so now let's talk about how to use this information to find the relative extrema. And I apologize, I do not know what happened and how I accidentally erased some of this, but hopefully you can see it. All right, there we go. So back to relative extrema. Basically, we have to look at what's going on around each one of these points. So here, for x equals 1, we're going from positive to negative, right? So what that's going to look like is that's going to look like this. So that tells me it's going to be a relative max. Over here, we're going from a negative slope to a positive slope. So that tells me at x equals 3, I'm going to have a relative minimum. All right, and then finally, let's go ahead and find our global max and min. So to do this, we're going to use the candidates test. So as a refresher, the candidates test, basically we plug in all of our critical points, which are here and here, this 1 and 3, and then we also plug in the endpoints of our interval, which are 0 and 4. So that's this top one and this bottom one. So after I've done that, I went ahead and just wrote out the values here. And so what we find is we find that we actually have both two absolute maximum and two absolute minimum values. So let's go ahead and tie all of this together. First, we found out where the function was increasing and decreasing by looking at where the derivative was positive and where it was negative. Next, we found our relative maxima and minima by using a sign chart. And then finally, we use the candidates test to look at both the critical values and the endpoints to identify our absolute maximum values and our absolute minimum values, which in this case, we actually have a tie, so we have 2.